Welcome, everyone. Folks like us are gathering all around the world because we care so much about what's happening to our Earth right now. And some very clever people have put together a book called Earth Prayers from Around the World. Poems and prayers and invocations for honoring the Earth. And I'd like to share with you one of my favorites. We join with the earth and with each other to bring new life to the land, to restore the waters, to refresh the air. We join with the earth and with each other to renew the forests, to care for the plants, to protect the creatures. We join with the earth and with each other to celebrate the seas, to rejoice in the sunlight, to sing the song of the stars. We join with the earth and with each other to create the human community, to promote justice and peace, to remember the children. We join with the earth and with each other. We join together as many and diverse expressions of one loving mystery for the healing of the earth and the renewal of all life. And that's from the United Nations Environmental Program. And now we've been given permission to read a poem, but close from home, from Holly Ann Higgins from the Sechelt Nation, Kwatlimat, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She wasn't able to be with us, but here is her poem. The sun comes up on the mountaintop to wake the wild things. I will stand, I will stand, I will stand. The wind comes up like a gentle breeze and whispers to them all, I will stand, I will stand, I will stand. The birds all sing with joyous voice, a message filled with love. I will stand, I will stand, I will stand. All the animals, all the trees and shrubs, all the medicine, they will stand, they will stand, they will stand. They all come up to the mountaintop, all the ones who cared. That's you. I will stand, I will stand, I will stand. And now it's up to you and it's up to me to keep this mountain safe. We will stand, we will stand, we will stand. Thank you, and thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Dana. We want to give wonderful recognition to the fact that here we are not only on Sechelt territory, but on what in this building, that's what's becoming an increasingly important community space for all. So thank you to the Sechelt Nation and the peoples up and down the coast. I've covered off the agenda. We're going to have the time for question and answers later. I want to give special thanks to the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association, the Alliance for Democracy, and all of the other volunteers that have helped make this second Coal Hard Facts Forum possible. And special thanks to Terra Firma Digital Art for the posters, they're just terrific, and Straight Coffee for the generous donation of the coffee, and for people who baked and bought things. We won't be taking a formal coffee break during the course of that because studies have shown that the average 10-minute coffee break takes 55 minutes. And so you just get up and help yourself during the course. That's how we'll do it. The washrooms, the women's on that side, men's on that side, so help yourself. If you haven't already turned off your electronic devices, please do so. We're going to try and keep to time, and for the aid of the speakers, I have a fluorescent pink card, which, unless they're colorblind, they won't miss it. And then first it'll be 2 minutes left to go, and then 1 minute left to go, and then out comes the hook, because we want to make sure that we get through the program and have time for you, because quite frankly, you're the most important element in this whole gathering, because you're the ones who are going to be carrying the message out to our various communities. So we'll start right away with Lynn Chapman. Lynn has lived in Roberts Creek since 1975, been involved in the community in peace and social justice, as a teacher, school trustee for 15 years. She's now a happy elder youth student at CapView. Been 20 years a community health care worker, a shop steward, and she's involved in the environment and democracy movement here. And she wants to thank her husband and family who have allowed her to be such a good activist. And Lynn's going to bring us up to speed on the recent history of the proposed shipment of U.S. thermal coal through BC ports, which of course they're shipping it through BC ports because Americans are smart enough not to let that happen. Lynn Chapman.
Welcome everybody. This is really exciting. It's wonderful to see a nice full room and to see people who care enough about our community and about what's going on in the environment to step out on a beautiful day and come to a meeting to find out more information. So thank you all for coming. So I was going to tell you briefly about the Salish Sea Coal Committee, and basically what I'll say is we've had 1 year. The last forum saw us come together as a group of people committed to stopping U.S. thermal coal from going up and down the Salish Sea. And so we've been committed to that task. We've done a whole bunch of research. We've had a really steep learning curve, and it's been a great year. Second thing I want to tell you about is the actions that we've undertaken. One of the actions was we prepared vast amounts of documents, and we used those documents to not only educate ourselves, but to educate representatives at the local government level to encourage them to support the work of getting the word out and having local governments take action to stop the coal in the Salish Sea. And I would just like to acknowledge the leadership of the SCRD, who sponsored a motion that ended up going to the UBCM, which is the Union of British Columbia, 1 minute left. Excuse me. Union of British Columbia Municipalities. Thank you very much. Okay, and that motion went forward. And so the motion was to stop the coal barging before we had a health assessment, before we had an environmental assessment. Pretty key. And so our MP, we've met with our MP, John Weston, and we're working with him to try and bring that message to Port Metro Vancouver and to government through in the department or the Ministry of Transportation. So there's some significant actions that we've been able to accomplish together. One of the major things we've done is to build a coalition with the larger community of concerned groups and concerned citizens, and I think that's really important. So the last thing I want to tell you about is the future. And one thing that I want to tell you about is that Lasqueti Island residents and mariners put on what I think was quite a kick-ass blockade of Sabine Channel. So our future will be more of that if we need to. And then the last thing I want to say is the purpose here is to continue education, advocacy, and action to stop dirty U.S. thermal coal in the Salish Sea. And you all can help do that. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, Lynn. Our next speaker is Laura Benson. She's director of the Dogwood Initiative Beyond Coal campaign, and they've been doing magnificent work. She's a mother of two, lives in Burnaby, where I grew up. Newly minted Canadian citizen. From where? US. Oh, some of our best Canadians used to be Americans. She's got a master's degree in urban studies from Simon Fraser University, a background in community organizing and policy advocacy for environmental and economic justice. And as I said in the introductory remarks, Laura's going to sort of cover the big picture. So join me in welcoming Laura Benson.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I want to start by saying thank you very much to Chief Craigan and the Sechelt Band for welcoming us here today. And thank you all for coming. So yes, Lynn and the Salish Sea Coal Committee have asked me to give a bit of context and a big picture. So I am taking this on as a bit of a storytelling exercise. So I'm kind of just going to babble at you for a while until the hook comes out. And go through a few websites that will help, I think, illustrate the story, I hope. So I'm going to start with an aside, which is probably the worst possible thing to do when you're speaking publicly. But the aside is this map is on a website called Coal Export Stories, built for us by the amazing Owen Moriarty, who's in the back of the room, our videographer for the movement. Where we are asking folks to submit statements that are then mapped along the route, the coal export route, all the way from the mines in Wyoming and Montana through to export terminals here in BC. So all those dots you see on the map are actually videos or written statements from folks who live along that route. But the map is really to just sort of illustrate to you, where is this coal coming from? Why are we faced with these proposals and this problem? So starting about in 2010, 2011, big coal companies that are mining in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming and Montana in the US started to make plans to export their dirty, dusty, volatile product to Asian markets. Why? Because they're getting desperate. They've always been able to sell to the domestic market to fuel coal-fired power plants in the US. Well, the US finally started to shape up a bit, is trying to transition off of coal, is shutting down polluting power plants, and that means their domestic market is drying up. So they're desperate to, instead of saying to themselves as an industry, maybe we should look at the future of doom for our product and start investing in something new, something that will take us into the future. They're trying to keep the industry on life support by exporting that product to China, Korea, Japan. So the problem with that plan is that the only place on the west coast of North America that actually exports coal is BC. So, and we have for decades, we've exported our own metallurgical coal for steel making. But it's the only place that this Powder River Basin thermal coal has been able to sneak a leg into the export market at West Shore terminals and Delta. Because there was an existing coal terminal, they started buying up extra capacity with really no input at all or even notice to the public, except that people in Surrey, White Rock, and Delta started seeing coal trains coming through their cities. That was public notice. So coal companies started joining together to propose bigger terminals all up and down the west coast of Washington and Oregon and here in BC because there is such small capacity and no existing coal export terminals in Washington and Oregon. But residents and community leaders said, no way, we're not going to stand for this. This is not the kind of region we are. It's not the future we want. And came together in a pretty powerful coalition called Power Past Coal. So as you can sort of see here, Power Past Coal is an ever-growing alliance of health, environmental businesses, clean energy, faith, and community groups working to stop coal export off the West Coast. So in the face of this widespread opposition and the pretty sophisticated campaign that Power Past Coal has mounted, out of 7 proposals for new export terminals, 3 have been withdrawn in Washington and Oregon. A 4th proposal was rejected in May of this year by the state of Oregon, which denied a permit for a proposed terminal on the Columbia River, effectively killing the project. And the 2 remaining proposals for large-scale coal export terminals in Washington are now plodding their way through a very slow environmental assessment process, which is required by federal and state law in the United States, and will include health impact assessments and is shaped at every step of the way by public input. So that leaves one proposal, the one that we're facing here, the Fraser Surrey Docks Texada Island transshipment proposal. And from early on in their campaign, Power Pass Coal heard pushback from the industry that, listen, if you don't want to build these terminals, if you don't want to export coal, we'll just take it to BC. They're happy to ship coal, and they'll get all the jobs that you're missing out on. So Power Pass Coal realized we're going to need to build some partnerships with folks in BC. So that's kind of where Dogwood came into the picture, because at about the same time, 2011, Dogwood and other groups here in BC were starting to look at this issue of coal exports and expansion. And back in 2011, Dogwood put together this report. Oh, you can't really see what that is. Anyway, it's a report that you can look up online called BC's Dirty Secret. It was the first place that really we added up the sum of the vast and terrifying sum of coal export expansion that could happen if all the proposed new mines went through, if all the proposed export terminal expansions went through. And so from that, I would say voters taking action on climate change really got into the vanguard of this movement by running with that issue and really pulling it out of the shadows and making coal export expansion an issue of concern here in BC. And that's about the time Power Pass Coal reached out to find a Canadian partner, and Dogwood came on board. In late 2012, they brought me on in 2013, and I jumped into a huge groundswell of community-based opposition and a people-powered movement that had already taken, I don't know, what's the right metaphor? Anyway, but thanks to the efforts of voters taking action on climate change, all those little fires had really grown into the birth of a movement in opposition to this expansion of coal exports in BC. Now, because of our pathetic environmental laws, which Anna is going to talk to us about later, and the wildly undemocratic nature of decision-making around coal exports in BC, at first the Fraser Surrey Texada project was really seen as a shoo-in. It was the easiest, quickest route for Powder River Basin coal to get to market. And we saw business as usual with an earlier proposal at Neptune terminals to expand their facilities there. Now, the decision maker on these is Port Metro Vancouver, which is a federal port authority that oversees port terminals in the Lower Mainland. So when the Neptune terminal expansion came up, VTACC, other local community groups got wind of it. There was hardly even public notice. Got wind, started raising concerns, including concerns from our chief medical health officers at Fraser and Vancouver Coastal Health Authorities. The port got a flood of letters in December of 2012, and in the first week of January, rubber stamped the project, approved it, and called the public input. It had gotten just a bunch of form letters. So this is what we thought we could expect with the Fraser Surrey Docks project as well. And probably would have gotten the same treatment, a rubber stamp, had it not been for the amazing groundwork that had already occurred, thanks to voters taking action on climate change, other community groups, and that groundswell of opposition. And I would say outrage in the face of that, what had happened with the Neptune project. We were not going to stand for that again. And that's kind of where I came in. So it's been an amazing year and a half, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a little bit of an overview about what's happened since then. And there's tons of stuff I'm going to leave out, so my apologies ahead of time. So even this is a little outdated now, which apologies, but that's actually good news. What Dogwood Initiative really tried to bring to this people-powered movement was our ability to build and mobilize a large and ever-growing province-wide base of supporters, and mobilize those folks at key decision-making points, and help sort of knit together this amazing coalition of groups working in BC with the coalition of groups working in the United States and be that link. So to date, we now have over 33,000 signatures on our Beyond Coal petition, and taken together with other petition signatures from groups like Communities in Coal, that's more than 46,000 British Columbians who are now concerned and opposed about this proposal to expand U.S. thermal coal exports. So thanks to that citizen effort, starting with New Westminster, it sort of sparked a wave of municipal and regional government resolutions, either calling for health and environmental impact assessments or just opposing this Fraser-Surrey Docks Texada Island project outright. We're now up to 14 of those resolutions, plus the amazing victory that Lynn mentioned at the Union of BC Municipalities in September, which was largely thanks to the leadership of Sunshine Coast Regional District Director Donna Sugar. Is Donna here? Yes. Thank you, Donna. And 6 school boards have also passed resolutions. This sort of paralleled what I kind of call the era of community forums, where just all across southern BC, communities came together to hold forums just like this. That happened a year ago here in this hall, to inform themselves and start taking action. It resulted in the formation of new groups like the Salish Sea Coal Committee, the amazing Communities in Coal, which is working out of South Surrey and White Rock. And then we saw continued leadership from the chief medical officers of Fraser and Vancouver Coastal Health Authorities, which really strengthened the movement in a huge way, I would say, when they called for a full, comprehensive, independent health impact assessment covering the whole scope of this bizarre transshipment project that comes from the US border all the way to Texada Island and out to sea. And so many organizations, community groups, environmental groups, 4 unions, including the teachers and the nurses, have come on board. Neighborhood associations, you name it, have lent their support in the last couple of years. So this is a powerful force, and it added up. It forced Port Metro Vancouver, who was sort of the senior decision maker on this project, to delay the project and to amend the way that it went through the approval process. Now, unfortunately, the responses every time have been wholly inadequate. So, for example, we demanded public hearings on the project. Instead, they got Fraser-Surrey Docks to hold a couple of open houses in Surrey only. We asked for a health impact assessment, of course. The port asked the company to do an environmental impact assessment, which it made up the rules for as it went along because it did not trigger the federal or provincial environmental assessment acts. On that assessment, more than 4,000 people submitted comments. Does anyone want to guess how many of those comments were in favor of the proposal? 6, like less than 1%. Did that mean that they went back and did a health impact assessment or just scrapped the project entirely? No, they asked for a little more health data, didn't give anybody the data before they made the decision, and then approved the permit in August. So meanwhile, the port wasn't the only agency that has some say over this project. Obviously, it needs the Texada portion, and that's under provincial jurisdiction. You all know quite a bit about this. Many of you having tried to engage in the lack of process that there was around that permit for the Texada facility. Again, folks mostly got the runaround from the province. Donald's going to tell us a little bit more about this and give us an update on the latest there. But once again, the province gave us the runaround and responded, not our jurisdiction, pointed us back to the port. So what's left? The project now needs to get 2 major permits from Metro Vancouver, which is our regional district in the Lower Mainland, an air quality permit and a wastewater discharge permit. Now, the good news about our regional government is, of course, it's run by elected officials, Imagine that, who might actually be accountable and might actually hold a public comment process that might actually matter in the final decision. And so we're looking to that process as sort of the last battleground to stop Fraser Surrey Docks Texada in its tracks. So the fight is far from over. We're looking towards Metro Next, which is why in the last several weeks, Dogwood Initiative has been focusing quite a bit on the upcoming municipal elections, because that will have a big impact on, not only are we seeing amazing local leadership at that level, but in Metro Vancouver, that'll have a big impact on the outcome of that final permit process. So I'm just gonna leave you with one more website. I know this is like the worst possible thing you can do, is have a mixed message with like 5 different websites, but I'll leave you with one more website at the end, which is localvote2014.org, where you can input your postal code and it'll come up with candidate survey responses from your municipality. We asked candidates to answer questions on their position on oil and coal exports and local democracy issues, how much we should have a say over these projects. And you can see their responses on this website. And most importantly, get out and vote. So, thank you for letting me babble at you for a while. I hope that was a bit of a big picture.
Thanks very much, Laura. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Chief Calvin Craigan, who tells me that he was born just down here on the shore, grew up in Jervis Inlet, and has a deep and abiding understanding of Sechelt history and a tremendous wealth of traditional knowledge. He was installed as chief on March 30th, 2014, following Gary Feschuk, who also did a great job and who spoke at the first Coal Hard Facts program forum. And the Sechelt Nation has been there lockstep right along the way as we've gone through this process, and they provide great leadership. Calvin's really a shining example of the kind of courage and tenacity for his people, standing up and saying, we own this land, we're going to manage this land, and thankfully he's doing it for all of us, not just for Sechelt. So Calvin's going to bring us up to date on the position of the Sechelt. Chief Calvin.
Well, I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm always grateful that I'm still here walking this land, this most beautiful piece of land in all the world. And this winter will be my 70th winter walking this land. And I'm always so grateful, especially on a day like this, that we're still able to witness beautiful weather, the beautiful land, and all my beautiful people. I was at a fundraiser on Saturday with the BC Liberal government, and was able to share a dinner with the Premier. I have to share with you that she had no kind words for the Green Party, lesser kind words for the NDP. If there's any BC Liberal Party members here, would you please stand up? I noticed my tablecloth is green. But I'm so very happy and refreshed that concerned citizens are taking up the struggle to protect the land that we cherished for so many generations. I wish to share with you that I was born a hereditary chief, and what I discovered later on in my life, the responsibilities of being that person. I inherited the struggle from my father and grandfather to not only protect this land, but to bring our people forward the struggle to rid of ourselves of the provincial government and the Indian Affairs government from the federal government in Ottawa. When I first took the struggle over this year from Gary Feschuk, I met with the Ministry of Transport federally, and the words that she shared to all of us in West Vancouver were empty. And I made it known to her that her words didn't affect me whatsoever. When I asked her what she would do when devastation happens in Texada, she said, "Oh, the Coast Guard will be there." So my next question to her, I said, "What Coast Guard?" And since I took over leadership, I've brought an advertising group with me now. They document and cover everything that I do and say, and they were there and documented that meeting with the Ministry of Transport. Since then, we've sent many letters to the ministry. On Friday, we just sent one to Minister Bennett. Gary and I had breakfast with him 2 weeks ago when he announced to me that Site C was going to go forward. And at the breakfast meeting, he said, we may or may not construct it in a year or two. So he thought that was going to reassure me. But since then, we've been to the BC Aboriginal Awards, where we met the chiefs from that area. And on Friday, we sent a letter in opposition to Site C Dam. But we haven't stopped in the struggle. As you know, the band has taken on the struggle in many layers, on many agendas, and we continue to do so. Gary Feschuk has continued to meet with Minister Bennett, trying to encourage him that clean energy is a better way than Site C Dam. Gary continues to meet with the regional chiefs to promote Site C and wind energy. And through that process, Gary is meeting with deputy ministers to promote that. And what we found between the ministries, there's a struggle happening of clean energy versus LNG and pipeline. So there is a struggle happening in the Parliament buildings, and we're hoping to advocate those deputy ministers, those ministers who will take on the struggle for clean energy. I was shocked to hear our minister, our premier, declare that LNG is going to be great for the economy. LNG is great for the country. Fracking, there's nothing wrong with fracking. She literally said that. I couldn't believe it. You know, and fracking are damaging not only the land, but killing animals in the north that sustain the native people in the north. When I met with the Ministry of Transportation federally, I stated to her that Sabine Channel was a main source of sustainability for our people, since we are salmon people and we depend wholly on salmon. And that was going to be devastating for us if she was going to contaminate that. And I further stated to her that we've been struggling to rebuild the devastation that happened here 150 years ago by multinationals who came in and cleaned out the energy, cleaned out the forest, the old growth, and damaged our watersheds. Then on many fronts, our leaders have been rebuilding what was done in the past. And now that it's going to be our turn to go back and start harvesting sustainably, it's all going to be contaminated once again. And she had nothing to say to me about that. But we continue to protect our watersheds along with the SCRD and the local governments. And we're very happy that we're collaborating with them. We're very happy that they are supporting us. I just got a letter from the mayor last week, and it was a resolution by his council stating that they are living on our land. They are admitting that they are here as our guests. So I found the mayor to be quite sincere, and as I left his office, I explained to him that there was only one thing missing from his office, and he said, "What's that, Chief?" I said, "A picture of your landlord." So I'm having a big blow-up done. But the bugger got me on the way out of his door that day. He slapped one of his big pins on my chest, and his secretary took a picture. I said, "You're going to get it." But no, we're very happy that times have changed, atmospheres have changed for the better. When I was a young chief in the 70s, it seemed like we were alone, struggling to try to protect our land, struggling to be independent, struggling to take over jurisdiction to protect what we had. But I'm very happy to see you all here today and taking on the battle. And that's what it's going to take, concerned citizens up and down the coast to take on this battle, because the federal government and the provincial government have dropped the ball in terms of protecting the environment, the land, and all of its resources for the greater good of all of our people. We thought we were the only ones that they were going to devastate, but it's going to be each and every one of us. And each and every one of us have to stand up together to take on that battle. And as you know, I've started my own TV show, and my group, we're in Vancouver negotiating with other networks to pick it up, APTN and others. And doing that, we are going to expose what the governments are trying to do. You should know that when I first appeared on the Vaughan Palmer show in the Parliament buildings, the presidents of Unifor, Western Forest, picked that up and said, "Wow, there's a progressive chief. I think we want to meet with him." So I invited him here to a symposium of how we're going to develop our relationship in terms of harvesting sustainably. And we're going to change the way they did that in the past. So they're going to come here in the next couple of weeks. Vaughan Palmer's coming next weekend, and so on and so forth. So we're building that relationship. We're changing people's minds. And I see that's the way of taking on this battle, is that we have to do it with communication. And once again, I'm thanking you to be here to communicate and collaborate and work together. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Otto Langer. Otto is a fisheries and biologist, aquatic ecologist. He worked for the DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, for 32 years in habitat protection. He's a qualified expert who's given expert witness in well over 100 actions against pollution and habitat destruction in courts in Canada, from the Arctic to Newfoundland to Vancouver Island. The primary work is in BC, Yukon, and the Fraser River and the estuary. He's published many papers, been involved in habitat management programs, and after leaving government, he joined the David Suzuki Foundation, created the Marine Conservation Program, and in his so-called alleged retirement, and he volunteers for a host of organizations. This man is always busy, and he brings his extensive expertise and knowledge. He's a recipient of many prestigious awards. Please join me in welcoming Otto Langer to speak on science, politics, and the industrial agenda.
Well, it's great to be up here. I've had a few of my battles in the government, spending months of my life fighting to save Angus Creek, so I finally got back to it this morning to have a look at it, and there was chum salmon spawning in it. About 30 years ago, it was totally destroyed by Jackson logging. We spent weeks in court battling for that stream, and that's just a lesson that Chief Craigan mentioned, that you got to look at a long term, and come 30 years later, I look at the stream, it still hasn't recovered, and that was just from a slide on a logging road up the valley. So there's quite a time element to everything we talk about, and when we think into the future, we've got to ensure that the companies and the consultants think well into the future. If we can't think 100 years in the future, we're in real trouble. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of everything, I suppose, in my presentation. Here, I'll have to look at what I'm talking about. Oops, the mouse isn't working. Does this machine work? No. How did you make it work?
I just had websites up.
This is really odd. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we got it working finally. There. Okay, I want to talk about the spatial time relationship in terms of where we've been in the last 150 years, and I call it post-European contact. And really, the Europeans started off in British Columbia probably in a big-time way with the Caribou Gold Rush in 1859 or so. And over the last 150 years, a lot has changed in British Columbia, as you're all well aware of, and we can't blame it all on the Europeans. There's been many more groups of people that have lived in this land and have an impact on it. The anthropogenic impacts in our landscape has actually been quite phenomenal. And so we go from the first placer miners to, I just threw up a modern slide. This is what the vapor group is on. I won't have another picture of a schematic of jet fuel tankers now approved to come into the Fraser River, a large tank farm. And this tank farm is actually on Port Metro Vancouver lands, and they're benefiting it from renting it to the Vancouver Airport Fuel Consortium, and yet the Port Metro Vancouver have been entrusted by the federal government now to do environmental impact reviews in 17 harbors across Canada. All the harbors do their own environmental reviews. So you do a review of a project that's going to impact the estuary, you're going to make money from it, and then you approve it. And this is the governments we now have in place. Can you have a greater conflict of interest than the developer calling the hearings, doing the environmental assessments, and then approving the projects? And that's why we've got a real problem. So Metro, in our Metro Vancouver area, Port Metro Vancouver is probably the greatest threat we have now to the Fraser Estuary and that part of the Salish Sea, and the impacts carry well beyond their jurisdiction, right up to Texada Island and coal issues. No, it's still not working, darn it. Maybe if we turned it on, it would work. There. And over those last 150 years, and this is usually a presentation in itself of what we've all been through. Oops, sorry about that. We've had a tremendous amount of impact. If I had more time, I'd go through the 3 industrial ages we've been through. And the first one, of course, was after the gold rush rated to World War I. Then we had quite a rest. The environment had a rest from, we lost 67,000 young workers, and they're key to the economy. So the Canadian economy really slowed down. We had the Spanish flu, and the fish and the wildlife and our marshes and the ocean got quite a rest for a number of years until World War II came along. And then we ran into the second industrial revolution, and that really changed the British Columbia landscape with the highways, the ports, more railways, pipelines, Fraser River alone, 7 new pulp mills in the Fraser River. So you can imagine some of those impacts on the landscape. And that development carried on through the 1970s era, right on to about the year 2000, and I call that the era of enlightenment. We did have significant and great economic growth in Canada, but at that time, we also became very aware of what we were doing to the environment. We learned from our history, and darn it, we started putting laws in place. Some of us as young biologists pushed for we had to protect habitat in the Fisheries Act. Within a couple of years, we got habitat protection in the Fisheries Act, thanks to Pierre Trudeau, of all people. And later on, we got SIA, we got SARA, and we were almost smiling by the 1980s. We got a no net loss policy in the Fisheries Act. We hadn't reached a point of no net loss. We'd reached a point of slow net loss, but that was a great improvement over rapid net loss of habitat. And then things seemed to fall out. The bottom fell out of the building, and the roof collapsed on us. Whoops! What's going on here? And I won't comment a lot about the picture I have in the top, but I think that's really where our problems began. And we ran into this jobs, growth, and prosperity agenda. And about the same time, and I'm certain that it's been a conspiracy to some large degree. These things just didn't all happen at once after when the recession was over, and suddenly Port Metro Vancouver gets their most aggressive developer that we've ever had from England via Australia. Sylvester is his name, and Robin Sylvester. And he's hell-bent on basically industrializing Delta, paving over all the farmland, and in a sense get rid of the tunnel, get a big $8 billion bridge or so in place over the Fraser River, and dredge out the river and create it into a Rotterdam. And that's the plan, and that's where we're at right now. And I'm certain Harper's saying this is exactly what the gateway projects are all about. And out of that, we have spinning off Surrey, Texada coal projects, we have LNG, we have Site C, we have pipelines, we have tankers. Industry's got everything, really. It's been the perfect storm. We get rid of key environmental laws, we get rid of our habitat laws, we neutered the Navigable Waters Protection Act, we protected 1 million lakes and waterways in Canada, we went down to about probably 200 or 300. We neutered the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Habitat protection staff losses in DFO, they lost 50% of their staff, we've lost most of our scientists, and above all, we've lost our will to protect, and that'll even come up in a later slide or two. The cumulative impacts over those years, well, we've had a little bit of everything. You've all traveled around, you've seen the landscape, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. But from our past, we've gained a great environmental awareness. We've gained a greater will to protect. That's not reflected in government. And we have had some laws and policies put in place, but we're losing the battle in keeping them in place. We've got to restore them now. Whoops, I'm having a problem here today. Okay, issues in our Gulf of Georgia, Salish Sea area. Some of the bigger projects, and I consider in the Fraser River, these are some of the nails in the coffin of the Fraser River, is the Vancouver Airport Fuel Facilities Corporation jet fuel proposal in the Fraser River. In 1988, the same consortium of the 28 big airlines at Vancouver Airport wanted to barge fuel from Washington State into the Fraser River because it could save a few cents a litre and avoid provincial sales tax. And if you bring in fuel from the U.S., you don't have to pay U.S. fuel charges. So this is a way to avoid Canadian refineries and get cheap U.S. fuel to Canada. But the federal government properly, and this is 1988, the federal government before SIA said we've got to have an environmental review. It was the old Federal Environmental Assessment and Review Office. And they set up a panel of 3 distinguished people, held days of hearings, and they said, no, we can't have this in the Fraser Estuary. It's too great a threat to the fish and wildlife resources and to people. So it was rejected. And I think that's 25 years ago. Nowadays, we have a proposal 10 times larger to bring in 80,000-ton tankers from China, India, Singapore, so they can avoid American fuel and get cheaper fuel from the Far East, $1.50 saving. And that was approved by our provincial government. The federal government wasn't even there to do a review because they've delegated to Port Metro Vancouver, and Port Metro Vancouver got together with the BC Environmental Assessment Office and said, yeah, this is great, there's no problem at all, and we get an approval in place. So you can see where we've gone in the last 25 years. Why did we protect the environment much better in the 1980s than we do in 2013, 2014? There's something really sick in this land. Some of the impacts of all the coal barges, the tankers, and we're talking about hundreds, 1,000 more tankers and barges and that in the Strait of Georgia. Tremendous noise problems, problems for our whales. There are going to be spills and kills. It's not if, it's when they occur. And the airport people say, well, we'll only have a 50-gallon spill every 6 years in the Fraser River, a 50-barrel spill. That's a lot of liters of toxic, explosive, flammable kerosene in the river. And their solution was to take fire hoses and just flush it out in the river and let it evaporate. That was their solution in their environmental impact review. And we raised hell. And then they said, well, in every 30 years, we'll only have a 1,000-barrel spill in the river. And the province has accepted this as totally acceptable for the Fraser River. If you have a 50-barrel spill in the Fraser River at the time of a sockeye salmon run, you've got to shut down the whole fishery. It'll contaminate the gear. It may not kill the adult salmon, but it'll contaminate them. No one will be able to eat them. Can you imagine the impact to the Aboriginal fishery, the food fishery, the commercial fishermen, the sports fishermen when you shut down a big fishery? And basically the province ignored all of that. And through all of this, where was Federal Environment Canada? Where was DFO? In 1985, I took one of the federal leads in DFO to fight the jet fuel proposal, and we got it rejected. Nowadays, they don't even appear there. And during 1,000 days of this environmental review, there wasn't 1 minute of public hearings. And this is the BC environmental assessment process. So we've now taken them to court, and the group is called Vapor in Richmond. And I think that's almost our last resort, and you see more and more of that happening, and that's quite unfortunate. It's a costly thing to do, but the government's not listening, and it's totally jobs, economic growth, and growth at any cost. And I guess in my wildest nightmares, I didn't think we'd reach this point, probably in the 1980s, when I thought things could only get better, they couldn't get worse. Well, they've gotten a lot worse. We're back into the 1960s again right now. And just one point I'll make out here, and you saw in earlier pictures the Roberts Bank. It was always called the Roberts Bank Superport. And the coal pile is the original port, West Shore Terminals, and then behind it to the upper right-hand side, that was developed as the container port. And now they say this just isn't adequate anymore. And the big new pod that they want to put to the left-hand side, that's Roberts Bank Terminal 2 that we're also fighting. And you can imagine this being stuck in the Strait of Georgia, how that affects the ocean currents, how this affects salmon movements. It's quite an insult to the environment, and this is another battle. We not only have jet fuel, we have coal here, we have Neptune terminals. Now we're going to have another superport, which is a massive insult to Roberts Banks. It never seems to end, and some of these projects are going to give rise to massive habitat impacts. There's no doubt about it. When we look at the existing Roberts Bank port, the coal facility there, and I was involved in it, and I saw the pile of sand being built there before there was coal on it when I first joined government in 1969. And within a matter of months, there were complaints from fishermen and from people up living on Tsawwassen Heights. There were even claims people painted their house with enamel, which dried rather slowly, and there was a windstorm, and their house would turn gray with the coal dust stuck on it. And then the National Harbor Board would have to pay them to repaint their house again. But coal dust does move around. That was pretty obvious with this first coal port that we had in that part of the world. We have light problems. People are always complaining about the lights. The noise is phenomenal at that port. I've camped down at the tip of Point Roberts, 4 kilometers away. In the middle of the night, you can just hear the coal port going 24 hours a day. I'd hate to live in that part of the world, but you can imagine that impact on wildlife and the fisheries. And as I mentioned in the photograph, tremendous blockage to the marine currents, sediment movements, and the fish movements in that area. The Surrey Texada dock proposal, thank God, I'd like to think it hasn't been approved, but as far as Port Metro Vancouver and that environmental assessment fiasco is involved, it's an okay. Of course, we're going to have noise, we're going to have lights, we're going to have dust, we're going to have spills. You do have coal spills. We had quite a large one at Roberts Bank a few years ago when ships went through that giant gantry structure you saw in an earlier picture. And it's a phenomenal increase in river and ocean traffic. And if you don't think there's a dust problem, just look at this picture I took last fall. This is a Surrey Fraser dock where they'd bring the American thermal coal, and the facility will be built here. And soybean is a pretty clean commodity. In fact, it's clean enough that we eat the darn stuff. And here they're loading it, and they can't control the dust from a food product. And Metro Vancouver has taken action against them. Well, they've gone to court now saying, gee, we're exempt from local controls. We're on federal land. And if you can't load soybeans without creating a massive problem that people in surrounding hillsides can't put up with, you imagine what coal will do. And that's just an industrial commodity. We're probably going to handle it a bit more carelessly than a food product. Now let's get a little bit more scientific. Coal dust impacts from the air and runoff. And runoff is a big problem. Probably you're going to maybe lose more tons from the runoff of a coal port than you will from the windstorms. It's just that it depends who you are, whether you're a human a kilometer away or you're a crab living around the dock area. In the past, in the Kootenays, Alberta, Vancouver Island, coast discharges and dumping of coal waste in the ocean was just largely ignored. It wasn't considered a problem at all. And if you go to Catamount in the Eastern Rockies in Alberta, you still see the coal running off from the old mines right into the river. In McLeod River, no one's doing anything about it. The first real concern was when some of us young biologists were hired and the Roberts Bank port started loading up coal there, and we started getting complaints. And our first report was published in 1977. I won't say anything more about it other than I'll show a few slides from that work. Then in about 1980, I was called as a witness for the Attorney General of BC to help prosecute Byron Creek collieries who polluted Michelle Creek in the Kootenays with coal dust, where the proved coal dust was deleterious. I was called as an expert witness at Bull Moose Mines and Tumbler Ridge in about 1998, and we were able to prove once again coal dust or coal in water was a deleterious substance. Last year we had a tulamine and obed spill into the Athabasca River. Nothing seems to be happening in terms of enforcement action. The government has folded their books and gone home. And bringing it back to here, and since Donald Gordon is here, thank God I gave him credit for these photographs. This is the coal facility we have here. And when I look at a photograph, even something taken from space, I would say, yes, we've got a coal dust problem. Not all the coal is staying in the port. It's drifting off into the right side of that photograph. I think the provincial government, or Donald can correct me, said, no, that's just wood waste. It's not coal dust at all. But it's not that you will have a coal dust problem and a coal pollution contamination problem. You've got it already, and this is a small facility. I won't say anything more. I don't want to steal his fire. A couple more pictures from him, and I won't comment on the pictures, but many more recent studies have been done on coal dust and much more better impact information available. There is no doubt it's a deleterious substance. Despite that, EcoJustice went to Ottawa several months ago and said, we've had a coal dust spill into Burnaby Creek. What are you going to do? And a lawyer in Ottawa for the Minister of Fisheries wrote back, as coal is generally not considered deleterious, no immediate violation of the Fisheries Act was observed. So you can see Harper has gotten right down into the scientists and to the lawyers to prove that coal dust is not a deleterious substance, but probably nothing else is a deleterious substance, and hardly anything can harm habitat anymore because that's not even in the Fisheries Act anymore. So you can see how Harper's really affected environmental protection in Canada. Okay, you're looking at some data from the work we did in the early 1970s. You can see the gill space in a crab gill, which is a lung of the crab. And the gill lamellae is a tissue that you'd find in the gill of a rainbow trout, similar to our lung. And this is crabs that have lived on clean sand for 22 days. And we did much more work than presented here, but a 12% coal dust, which you can find around the docks and that. You can see these sharp little particles of black starting to accumulate in the gills. And at 50% coal dust, you can find that around dock areas because the surface sediments can almost be 100% coal dust. You can see tremendous clogging of the gills. Running out of time, so I won't comment too much more on that. Dust impacts, there is going to be habitat contamination. You're going to have excessive traffic. It's going to affect their gills. It's going to affect their burrowing behavior. The more coral dust you have, the crabs disappear in the sediments. They don't crawl on the surface of sediments, and it'll affect the fish gills. However, it's a cumulative impact of jet fuel, coal dust, Roberts Bank 2, more traffic that must be addressed. Then we look at the consultant study, and each one of them say, well, our project is going to be an insignificant impact, forget about it, and we're missing the boat in the environmental assessment game. Why all of this now? Well, I've sort of covered it earlier on. I think it's really the jobs, economic growth, out of control, Port Metro Vancouver, ineffective environmental assessments, and this is a perfect storm, and it depends whether you enjoy storms or not. We're not enjoying the storm, but industry is going to benefit greatly from it. Have we forgotten our natural heritage? It's still a relatively healthy waterway, but it's endangered, and I think we have to really stand up and be noticed. What can we do? We have to be more strategic, political, and legal in our approach. We have to focus on the green vote and get out the young vote. We have to protect and restore what we had prior to the year 2000. NGOs and fishing game groups have to get together. They don't get together at all right now. We have to cultivate greater public concern and turn that concern into action. We have to be more assertive than we often are on most of these issues, get into court. And most losses are forever. It'll take 100 years to recover a lot of losses. And we have to demand electoral reform, and we have to elect more responsible governments than we've been electing to date. Thank you. I'll just make one additional comment, and I couldn't resist putting this in when I and Cindy Harlow and the crowd here worked with federal fisheries. We used to handle these pencils and pens out, no habitat, no fish. DFO no longer handles out these pens and pencils anymore.
Thanks very much, Otto. Our next speaker without a name tag is Anna Johnston. Anne is a staff lawyer with the West Coast Environmental Law, the oldest environmental legal organization in BC. She's been providing various groups with environmental legal information and advice to British Columbians, as well as representing community groups. First Nations has been consulting with the BC government, including key environmental law reform priorities, provides legal education, advocacy tools, and how to reverse the federal government's gutting of environmental laws, which Otto has gone at some length. And so Anna's going to bring us up to speed on the various environmental legislative changes. Anna Johnston.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to thank the Sechelt Band for hosting us on their beautiful territory, and to the SCCA for organizing this event, and to all of you for coming out on this gorgeous Saturday to sit inside and watch slideshows. I have to say that if you're trying to keep the coast a secret, you're doing a pretty terrible job. Great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to be giving a brief overview of the federal legal landscape. So as many of you know, in 2012, our core federal environmental laws were gutted by two major omnibus bills, Bills C-38 and 45. I'm going to start off by providing a little backstory to what went on to make those changes occur. In the late 2000s, DFO undertook consultations on the Fisheries Act in an effort to modernize it, and especially the habitat protection provisions. They consulted with a number of different groups, industry groups, provinces, environmental groups, and out of all of those recommendations, it's industries report back to the government on the changes they want that are the most interesting. In particular, industry, we have, sorry, I should explain how I know this, we have access to information documents that show all of the consultations. And so we have industry's report that says that industry was complaining that the habitat protection provisions especially were too broadly applied. The threshold for harm was much too low, and that they didn't want to have to be accountable to both provincial and federal governments. They found all of that red tape to be too onerous a burden. Around the same time, there was a 7-year review of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act that again involved a number of different groups, stakeholder groups, environmental groups. And again, industry made a very similar suite of complaints that the timelines for projects were too long, they were being dragged out by various environmental and community concerns. Proponents were frustrated that they had to undergo both provincial and federal environmental assessments, or even just one assessment, but under both laws. Too many projects, they said, needed to get assessed for their impacts. And then in 2011, we have a letter from the EFI to our Minister of Environment and Joe Oliver, as you can see here, suggesting that they have some major recommendations for the whole suite of environmental laws in Canada. The Energy Framework Initiative is a group of industry associations that were some of the major players in the consultations under the Fisheries Act and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So about a month later, we saw the letter come out from Joe Oliver, the open letter that talked about how radical environmental groups under foreign funding were getting in the way of the diversification of economic development in Canada, which really began the kind of witch hunt on environmental groups across the country, but especially in British Columbia. There's quite a bit of writing there. I won't expect you to read all of it. It's, I'm happy, I should say that I'm happy to provide any of the documents that I referred to in my presentation. I'm happy to just come and talk to me after and give me your email and I can send them to you. So later on in 2012, then we saw Bills C-38 and 45. In C-38, we saw the Fisheries Act get significantly amended to reduce habitat protection, to expand federal powers. We saw the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act repealed and replaced with a new one. We saw the Species at Risk Act amended, and also the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act repealed. A few months later, the Fisheries Act was gutted even further. The Navigable Waters Protection Act was significantly amended to remove protection of over 99% of Canada's lakes and rivers. The outcry, the public outcry to these changes, and I'm going to be describing each of these in turn, but the public outcry was huge. Thousands and thousands of Canadians represented by hundreds of organizations, former DFO, or former fisheries ministers, 3 former fisheries ministers formally wrote the government to oppose these changes. Scientists from across the country, from around the world opposed them, and the changes were brought into, all of these amendments and changes were brought in completely unaltered from their original state in the omnibus bills. So, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, now SEA 2012, the major changes that occurred in that act, probably the most significant one is that under the new law, only projects that are listed in regulations get an environmental assessment. So the way that it used to happen, any project that required federal permitting, federal funding that occurred on federal lands that involved the federal government in any way, it received some form of environmental assessment, whether it was a screening assessment or the more robust comprehensive reviews. Now, if it's not listed on the schedule, it doesn't get assessed. So what that meant was that about 90% of the projects that used to get environmental assessments by the federal government no longer get an environmental review. In the month following the enactment of Bill C-38 and the new SEA 2012, about 3,000 environmental assessments were canceled across the country. The new act also narrows the scope of the effects that are considered in environmental assessments. So it used to be that heritage and human health and cultural effects were considered they were just considered to be environmental effects. Now they're only considered in limited cases. It also imposes mandatory timelines, which has been a very, very major obstacle to groups and to individuals who are attempting to participate in environmental assessments. As we saw in the environmental assessment of the Site C Dam, I represent a community group up in Fort St. John, and they were very, very challenged to get their experts to be able to review the materials and to draft their own reports in time for the mandatory timelines that the panel had to impose in order for the review to be concluded within the mandatory timelines under SIA 2012. And so it's really crippled people's ability to bring forth meaningful information into the review process. It also allows for the federal government to substitute provincial assessments for federal ones. So it used to be the case that the federal government always had to have some sort of a role to play. BC and the feds often collaborated on joint environmental assessments. Now, if the provincial government requests that the federal government substitute the federal process for the BC one, the federal minister must say yes if she deems it to be an appropriate case for a substitution, which essentially just means that if she approves it, there is no federal assessment. The feds just rely on the provincial assessment, which is a even weaker assessment process than this new federal one. So since the implementation of this act and the memorandum of understanding that the province and the feds entered into approximately a year ago, I think, every substitution request that the province has made, I think it's 10 or 11 now, the feds have approved. So we've just seen the end of federal environmental assessments in British Columbia. So the Fisheries Act gets even gloomier. Probably the most significant amendment to the Fisheries Act was the reduction in protection of fish habitat. It used to be the case that any harmful alteration, damage, or destruction of fish habitat was prohibited under the Act. You had to get a permit from DFO in order to harm fish habitat. Now, serious harm to fish habitat is prohibited. And so they've raised that threshold a little bit. Instead of just doing harm being prohibited, the harm has to be of a serious nature. The one sort of saving grace about this is DFO came out with policy a little bit after this provision was brought into effect. And DFO policy has taken the kind of the best case scenario interpretation of what serious harm is. It's still just policy, and that's actually created quite a few more questions about whether or not industry groups are going to start to litigate if DFO holds this threshold of serious harm to the lower threshold of the old provision. So it's raised all sorts of questions about what constitutes serious harm and how many of these not so serious harms can occur before the cumulative impacts of all those less serious harms really begin to add up. Another very significant amendment was the elimination of protection of fish habitat for non-fisheries fish. So now, instead of, it used to be the case that all fish were protected under the Fisheries Act. Now, these protection provisions only apply to fish that belong to a commercial, recreational, or aboriginal fishery, or the fish that support such a fishery. Again, raising all sorts of questions. Your guess is as good as mine. Otto probably has the best idea of what's going to constitute a supporting fish. Fisheries fish are any fish that are regulated by provincial regulation. I've talked with DFO conservation officers who have taken the position that all fish in BC will retain protection because they all essentially fall under some sort of a provincial fisheries regulation. But then I'm working with a community group on the island right now that are opposing the harvesting of seaweed on the beach, and that seaweed is habitat to God. Well, herring, yeah, but yes, sand lance and something else. Anyways, so they've been consulting with DFO. DFO hasn't issued a permit to authorize this harm to fish habitat, nor have they, despite repeated requests by this community group, approached the company that's doing the harvesting to tell them that they need to get a permit. And they have said that they have not determined whether or not the sand lance are covered by the new habitat protection provisions. So what we're starting to see now is that certain species aren't being protected under the new provisions. The amendments also enabled Cabinet and the Minister to, it gave them the, extra powers to completely exclude certain species of fish. Cabinet now can just exclude an entire species of fish from the habitat protection provisions. She can exclude an entire water body from the habitat protection provisions. They can, I believe its Cabinet can also authorize certain individuals or groups or provinces, or say an industry group, authorize them to have control over issuing those permits to do harm to fish habitat. So a much broader expansion of the government's powers to enable harms to occur. The Navigable Waters Protection Act is now the Navigation Protection Act. It was amended in Bill C-45 in a few different ways, but the biggest way was that it, as with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act used to protect all navigable waters in Canada. So anything that you could either float a stick down or a canoe down was considered a navigable water. Now, only waters that are listed in a schedule are protected by the main protection provisions of the Navigation Protection Act. About 99% of Canada's lakes and rivers are they're not listed on that schedule, and so they've lost their protection. So for example, there's not a single water body on Vancouver Island that's protected under the Navigation Protection Act. Powell Lake is, the Pacific Ocean is, and the Fraser River is, but that's about it for around here. I might be running out of time. So it also, It also expanded government's ability to authorize certain harms. It removed the requirement that proponents give notice for projects that are going to interfere with navigations, and so that really restricts anybody's ability to understand projects that occur around them and to participate and to give their say in projects that could affect them. So the relevance of these amendments to the coal issue is it's quite possible that had SIA 2012, for example, not been brought in, that the Texada Island coal storage facility would require some sort of a federal review, because under the old act, anything that required a federal permit needed to get a federal environmental assessment of some sort. We've heard today, and we're going to hear more about how there are all sorts of concerns that the coal storage facility is impacting fish habitat, polluting waters, which would have probably triggered the requirement for an authorization to do harm to fish under the old Fisheries Act provisions, right? So now they've raised that threshold, so maybe that's not serious harm. But a couple of years ago, it would have been harm, which would have likely triggered an environmental assessment. So what we see is, in this situation, this is arguably one of those on-the-ground impacts of the federal environmental law changes. We've removed public participation rights, we've limited people's ability to have a say in the decisions that affect them, we've stopped reviewing projects for their environmental impact, and we've allowed much more harm to occur to the components of the environment that we care about most, without requiring proponents to apply for permits, to give their environmental review studies, to have any science showing what the impacts of these projects are going to be and whether or not those impacts can be avoided or just shouldn't be authorized at all. So it's a pretty gloomy note. I'm going to leave it on what you can do. I have a petition in the back, on that green table in the back, on the left corner there, just calling on the federal government to repeal the changes to the Fisheries Act, to enact a stronger sustainability assessment act to make sure that the impacts of all of our decisions really work towards the sustainable development of our communities and our environment and our economies. You can visit our website, envirolawsmatters.ca. I try to frequently post new materials, new stories about federal environmental law changes that are occurring. They're continuing to be gutted as right now the federal government's contemplating regulations under the new provisions of the Fisheries Act that will get rid of the requirement for fish farms to obtain authorization to dump aquatic drugs and pesticides into water. So this is still going on. So go to the website, sign the petition. I have literature in the back, and come and speak to me. I'm always available to answer questions, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Anna. Our next speaker is Donald Gordon, and Donald, his pedigree says that he arrived in a banana box when he first traveled up the BC coast by boat and did the same with his kids. And his family's been tied to Lasqueti Island for about 40 years, and it's sort of sadly ironic, given his unusual mode of transport, that as our provincial and federal governments try to turn us into a banana republic for the fossil fuel industries. Donald and Kevin Washbrook and a handful of others started VTACC, the Voters Taking Action for Climate Change, on their adjoining backyards in 2006. And they're so efficient, they're all volunteer and have zero overhead. There's not too many people who have organizations, zero overhead. Small and feisty, it works in the regulatory and electoral processes. Donald's going to tell us about the court challenge regarding the transshipment of the U.S. thermal coal. Donald Gordon.
Thank you to Calvin Craigan and the Sechelt First Nation for hosting this, and thank you to Calvin and the Sechelt First Nation for standing up on this, because this is something that we all need to learn how to do, and I think generally as Canadians, we've proven ourselves not very good at doing it. And I think we've got a lot to learn from people like Calvin Craigan and the Sechelt First Nation. So thank you very much. I don't have a PowerPoint, but thank you very much to Otto for putting up a few of my pictures that I took on the beach in Texada of the coal spilled on the beach up there. And when I was stomping around on the beach on Texada with, crunching over the coal and opening up the oysters and finding coal dust inside, I thought, there has to be a way to take these guys to court over this, because we can't just say, write an angry letter to the DFO and get a form letter back, which is what we've all got, right? So there's three things I want to tell you about today. I've only got 5 minutes. It's too nice a day to be stuck in here too long. But before I get on to the three things, everyone needs to stand up. So stand up those people who feel that we've all been subjected to an outrageous abuse of power. So the three things I want to tell you about are the court challenge that we just finished, that finished on Wednesday of this week. The second thing is a court challenge we have coming up. That's next year. And the third is something that I think will be of particular interest to everybody here, which is our recently finished critique of the proponents' plan for the open-topped coal barges that are going to be running straight by you here. So our first court challenge was directed at the Texada permit amendment to transform this very small coal handling facility they have there, which is mostly for coal coming from Vancouver Island and going to the Richmond cement plant. And their plan, of course, is to transform that into an international coal port. And they have done that, and they have got approval to do that from the provincial government from under the Mines Act. So we object to the idea that they can permit the Mines Act, which is about mining and about the operation of a mine and a mine site, and how they can use that to permit an international coal port. So that was the first thing we took them to court on. That was the first of our two arguments. By using the Mines Act, of course, they were able to argue that everything's taken care of. We don't need any involvement from the Environment Ministry, which is what they very successfully did. They initially said that the environment industry, oh yes, and the Environment Ministry, industry, same thing, would be involved, and then miraculously, no, we've actually decided that no permit will be necessary from the Ministry of the Environment. Mines can look after it all, like they did at Mount Polley. The other thing that we took them to court on at the beginning of this week was the fact that they withheld documents from the public. So they said the public can comment on their plan, but they didn't share the documents that we all needed to be able to comment knowledgeably on the plan. And I'm willing to bet that not only did they withhold the documents from the general public, but they also withheld documents from the First Nations involved. And I will definitely bet that Sechelt First Nation didn't get those documents. And I will bet that even the Sliammon First Nation, who said they had no problem with the plan, I'll bet even they had documents withheld from them. So we argued that for 3 days. First 3 days of this past week. It'll be months before we get a response. 2 minutes. Next topic. Our second court challenge is directed at the Port of Metro Vancouver. We're challenging two things. One is their environmental assessment, which you can all imagine is seriously flawed. Second thing, which is really quite interesting that we're challenging them on, is their bias. Because of course there's extremely strong evidence that this decision was entirely prejudged. Right? The fix was in from the moment it was applied for. Any pretext that the public could have a say was window dressing. Right? So we discovered through access to information requests that this federal government body was coordinating with the coal industry to manage the public message, and more importantly, to manage VTACC. So they would turn up at our public meetings. If any of you are out there today, you can report back. But they were actually representatives of the Port of Metro Vancouver and the coal industry were attending our public meetings and then reporting back to each other about how they would respond publicly in the media, etc., to the message that we were given. So yeah, fairly clear the fix was in. In my last minute, I'll just say you all will be interested in our critique of the open-topped coal barges that are going to be running past your front doors here. These barges will have 8-foot high walls. The coal is going to be stacked 20 feet high. The director of Surrey Fraser Docks proudly says they're as long as football fields. These aren't your standard barges. They pretend that these barges will stop operating if the wind is blowing more than 40 kilometers an hour. So when you get a week of rough weather, do they stop the trains all the way back to Montana? No. And how they've got around that is that there's no monitoring. They have had no monitoring of what the wind speeds are going to be. There's no mechanism for saying when they hit such a speed, you will have to stop. Something interesting they put in their original proposal was that, we will monitor any coal dust blowing off these barges. State-of-the-art monitoring devices. Don't worry, it's all under control. Very interesting that when the approval was provided, there is no monitoring required. If there's no monitoring, obviously, nobody can say that there's coal dust blowing off the top. So you can go to the VTACC website, VTACC. You can get your copy of our critique of the coal barge plan. I've got one copy here that I'd like to give to Calvin Craigan. But there's plenty more available online. Thank you, everybody.